"You will marry him," her father said, and Emma Carter had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether to scream run or sign her name on a contract that would sell her like livestock to a stranger in Wyoming. If you've ever been forced into a choice you didn't make, stay with Emma. This story will break your heart before it heals it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? Now let's begin. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Emma Carter knew something was wrong the moment her father called her into his study at 7:30 in the morning before breakfast, before the fire had even been properly lit. Charles Carter was not a morning man. He was not, truth be told, much of a father either. Not since her mother died 6 years ago and left him alone with a daughter he didn't know how to raise and debts he didn't know how to pay. Emma sat across from him at the heavy oak desk, her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her, her back straight, her face composed. She was 18 years old, and she had already learned that composure was the only armor a woman in her position could afford. Her father didn't look at her right away. He looked at the letter in his hands. He turned it over once, twice, then set it flat on the desk between them. "I've made an arrangement." Emma waited. A marriage arrangement. Still she waited. She had learned that too, that waiting often made men say more than they intended. His name is Nathan Harrison. He owns a cattle ranch in Laramie County, Wyoming. He is 34 years old, a widower, 3 children. Charles Carter cleared his throat. He needs a wife, someone capable, someone young enough to manage a household, manage the children, manage. "How much?" Emma said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Her father's jaw tightened. "That is not—" "How much did he pay you, father?" Charles Carter looked at his daughter, then really looked at her, and what she saw in his face wasn't shame. It was something worse. It was relief. The relief of a man who had found a solution and didn't want to examine it too closely. $4,000. And the cancellation of a debt I owe to his business associate. It's a fair arrangement, Emma. You'll have a home. Security. The man owns over 3,000 acres. I am not a parcel of land. Her voice was very quiet. I am not a debt settlement. You are my daughter, Charles said, and his voice had that particular firmness. She recognized the firmness that meant the discussion was over before it had begun. And I am your father. And this is what is going to happen. Emma looked at the letter on the desk. She looked at her father's hands. She looked at the brass inkwell shaped like a ship that her mother had given him on their wedding anniversary 22 years ago, which he had never once cleaned and which had gone dark with tarnish. When? You leave Boston on Friday. 3 days. She had 3 days. Emma stood. She picked up the letter. Her father didn't stop her. She read it in the hallway, her back against the wall, the paper trembling only slightly in her hands. Mr. Harrison has been informed of Miss Carter's education, her domestic competencies, and her age. He understands this is an arranged union and has agreed to treat Miss Carter with appropriate respect. He expects punctuality, adaptability, and a willingness to learn the demands of frontier life. He has made clear, looking for sentiment. He is looking for partnership, not looking for sentiment. Emma read that line 3 times. Then she folded the letter, put it in the pocket of her dress, and went to her room to begin packing. She packed 4 dresses, 2 pairs of boots, her mother's Bible, a box of pencils, and every book she owned that was small enough to fit without sacrificing the boots. She packed practical things. Thread needles, a small tin of salve her mother had always kept for cuts and burns. She packed her mother's silver hairbrush, even though it was the one impractical thing, because some things you cannot leave behind and remain yourself. She did not pack her fear. She told herself this very deliberately, standing at the center of her room at 2 in the morning on Wednesday. 2 days before she would board a train for a life she had not chosen. The fear was there. It was enormous. Actually, it filled her chest like water fills a bucket, cold and heavy, but she was not going to carry it openly. She was going to fold it up small and put it somewhere she couldn't see it, and she was going to be useful instead. Useful was the only thing she knew how to control. Emma Carter had grown up useful. She had been her mother's helper from the time she could stand, and when her mother died, she had run the Carter household herself, the cooking, the cleaning, the accounts. When her father forgot the social obligations, when he couldn't be bothered. She had educated herself from their library because her father hadn't seen the point of a formal education for a girl. She had taught herself Latin from a dusty grammar French, from a phrase book mathematics, from an accounting ledger she found in a cabinet. She had read everything she could find about medicine, agriculture, child development, household management. She told herself now that none of this had been wasted. She told herself that Wyoming needed all of it. She wasn't sure she believed herself, but she told herself anyway, and that was something. On Thursday, her father's business associate, a wiry man named Hollis Greer, who smelled of tobacco and wore a coat one size too large, came to the house to go over the particulars. He sat in the parlor and spoke about Emma in the third person, as if she weren't sitting 6 feet away from him. Harrison expects her in Cheyenne within the fortnight. He'll send a man to meet the stage. Hollis Greer consulted a folded paper. He wants her to understand that the ranch operates on a strict schedule. Early mornings. The children are well, they're a handful. I won't pretend otherwise. The oldest is 9. Boy. Then a girl of 7, another girl of 4. Their mother passed 18 months ago. Emma looked at him steadily. What did she die of? Hollis Greer blinked as if the question surprised him. Fever. Took her fast. And Mr. Harrison's disposition. His character. Is he a violent man? A drinking man? The silence in the room had a particular texture. Her father made a sound in his throat. Hollis Greer recovered. Nathan Harrison is a hard man, hard as they come. But he's not. He doesn't drink to excess, no. Violent. He paused, choosing words. He protects what's his. That's the nature of a frontier rancher. It's not the same as, is there anything else I should know before I travel 2,000 miles to marry him? Emma said. Hollis Greer looked at her for a long moment. Then he almost smiled. He didn't expect you to have this many questions. What did he expect? Something quieter. Emma folded her hands in her lap. Then perhaps he'll be pleasantly surprised. The train left Boston at 6:15 on a gray Friday morning, and Emma Carter stood on the platform with her trunk and her carpet bag, and looked at her father who had come to see her off in his good coat, which she found she could not interpret. Was it sentiment guilt, or simply the performance of a man who knew what was proper to do even when he hadn't done what was proper? You'll write? I'll write, she agreed. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly and then removed it. You're a capable girl, Emma. You always have been. She wanted to say, then why did you sell me? She wanted to say, capable was never enough. Was it not when the debts got high enough? She wanted to say a great many things, standing on that platform, with the cold morning pressing around her and the train engine breathing its great clouds of steam into the air. Instead, she said, goodbye, Father. She picked up her bag and she boarded the train. She did not look back. The train was loud, and it smelled of coal smoke and unwashed strangers, and something underneath both of those things that might have been loneliness, or might just have been the particular odor of long distances. Emma found her seat in the second-class car, of course second class. Her father hadn't stretched to first, and arranged her things, and opened her book and pretended to read. She wasn't reading. She was watching. Watching was something she had always been good at, this quiet cataloging of people and situations. This habit of paying attention that her father found irritating, and her mother had called a gift. The car was full of people in motion. People going somewhere, a family with 4 small children pressed together like a litter of sleeping animals. A drummer with sample cases stacked around him like a fort. 2 soldiers in blue coats playing cards. An older woman in black, who wept silently and continuously into a handkerchief. Emma looked at the weeping woman and thought, I will not do that. Not on this train. Not in front of strangers. Grief and fear were private things, and she was not going to spend 2,000 miles of rail becoming a person who couldn't control either. She thought about what she knew of Wyoming. It was not frankly very much. She had read what she could find, A geographical survey, some newspaper accounts of cattle drives and range disputes. One frankly alarming account of a blizzard in 1872 that had killed 17 men and 400 cattle over the course of a single night. She knew it was cold in winter and hot in summer, and that the land was vast and largely unforgiving, and that a person who went there expecting anything gentle was going to be disappointed. She knew Nathan Harrison had 3,000 acres of it. She thought about 3 children without her mother, the eldest 9 years old, and something moved in her chest that was neither fear nor grief, but something more complicated, something like purpose maybe, or the early careful beginning of responsibility. She had raised herself more or less. She thought she probably knew something about children who needed raising. The first 3 days passed in a blur of coal smoke and landscape, the east giving way grudgingly to the west, the cities thinning to towns, and the towns thinning to scattered settlements, and the settlements thinning to nothing at all. Just grass and sky, and the great rolling spine of the continent passing beneath the wheels. Emma read her books. She ate sparingly. She slept badly in the seat which was not built for sleeping, and woke each morning with a stiff neck and a stubborn determination to be fine. On the 4th day, she made a mistake. She had gotten up to stretch her legs moving through the car, and at the far end, she misjudged the lurch of the train and stumbled, catching herself on the back of a seat occupied by a man of about 40, with a sun-cracked face and the look of a rancher. "Careful there. I'm sorry." She righted herself. "I lost my balance." Long trip. He glanced at her trunk visible through the door at the end of the car. "Boston." Emma hesitated. "Yes." "Going where?" "Laramie County." Something shifted in the man's face. Not quite recognition, not quite pity, but some combination of both. "You got family out there." "I'm going to be married," Emma said, and heard how strange the words sounded, formal and distant, like a fact about someone else. The man nodded slowly. "Who's the lucky man?" "Nathan Harrison." The silence that followed had a very specific quality. Emma had been in enough rooms to know what silence meant when it had a shape. This one meant something. "You know him." The man cleared his throat. "I know of him. I rode through Laramie County 2 summers back." He paused. "Harrison's a hard man to miss. Big outfit. Runs a tight operation." Another pause. "He had a wife." "I know. She died." "She did." He looked out the window. "Hard thing that." "What else?" Emma said. "I beg your pardon. You were going to say something else, about him. You stopped." The man looked at her for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether she was the kind of woman who needed to be protected from information, or the kind who needed to have it. He decided, apparently, on the latter. "He's not an easy man," the rancher said. "I don't mean violent. I mean he doesn't waste words, doesn't waste much of anything. The kind of man who tells you what he needs done and expects it done, and doesn't understand why that should require any elaboration." He paused. "And he loved his wife something fierce. The whole county knew it. When she died, something went out of him." He looked at Emma directly. "I don't say that to discourage you. Just you ought to know what you're walking into." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That's the most useful thing anyone has told me since this arrangement was made." She thought about what the rancher had said for the remaining days of the train journey, turning it over. The way you turn a stone in your hand, examining it from all sides. Something went out of him. A man who had loved someone and lost her, and had apparently decided that love was not a thing. He was prepared to risk again, and had arranged instead for something practical. A capable woman. Someone young enough to be useful. A business solution to an emotional problem. Emma understood this, actually. She understood it more than she might have expected. She had done the same thing herself in a smaller way. When her mother died, had sealed something away, had decided that usefulness was safer than feeling, had arranged her inner life, the way you arrange a room. Everything in its proper place, nothing left out that might be tripped over. The difference was that she was 18 and he was 34, and she was being sent to him like a piece of furniture, and she had not had any say in the matter. She was still angry about that. She intended to stay angry about it too. Not loudly, anger displayed publicly was a weakness in her experience because it told people what to use against you. But quietly somewhere underneath everything else, like a pilot light. The anger said you are here by force. It said your father failed you. It said you are owed something from the universe, if not from the specific humans who had arranged her life for her, and you had better not forget it. The anger, she thought, would keep her honest. Cheyenne was bigger than she had expected, and smaller than Boston, and louder than either a chaos of wagons and livestock, and men in trail dust, and the smell of a stockyard that she could locate approximately 3 blocks before she reached it. She collected her trunk at the station, and stood on the platform, and looked around for whoever Nathan Harrison had sent to meet her. She spotted him immediately, because he was the one holding a sign that said, "Carter," in large, efficient letters. And because he looked like the kind of man who would write something in large, efficient letters, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, a face weathered past the point of expression, a hat that had seen better decades. "Miss Carter." Not a question. He had already identified her. "Yes. Jed Marsh. I work for Mr. Harrison. We'll take the stage to Laramie City and then ride to the ranch from there. We leave in 40 minutes. He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and started walking. "Any questions?" Emma picked up her carpet bag and followed. "How long is the ride from Laramie City to the ranch?" 3 hours good weather, 4 bad. "And what's the weather?" He looked at the sky with the assessing gaze of a man who reads weather the way other men read books. "Should be fine." "Has Mr. Harrison said anything about my arrival?" Jed Marsh was quiet for a moment. "He said to bring you safe and quick." "That's all?" "That's all." Emma nodded. She had expected as much. The stagecoach was brutal. There was no other word for it. The roads, calling them roads was generous, were frozen ruts of earth that the coach followed with a bone-shaking persistence, and by the time they reached Laramie City, Emma had bitten her tongue twice, lost a hairpin, and developed a comprehensive new respect for the human spinal column. She descended from the coach in Laramie City stiff and slightly bruised, and found Jed Marsh already loading her trunk onto a wagon. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without assistance, because she was not going to be the kind of woman who waited to be helped onto things. And Jed Marsh glanced at her with an expression that might in the right light have been approval. The ride to the ranch was 3.5 hours, because the weather was good, but not quite as good as Jed had predicted, and Emma spent most of it watching the landscape and thinking and trying not to think. The land was extraordinary, she would give it that. It was vast in a way that she had no framework for, having grown up in a city, a landscape of such monumental indifference to human beings that it was almost restful. Nothing out here cared about Charles Carter's debts. Nothing out here cared about Boston or letters of agreement or the price of a daughter. The land just went on and on and on, and the sky above it was enormous, and the wind was cold and constant, and Emma sat on the wagon seat and breathed the cold air and let it strip away temporarily everything she was carrying. Just for a few miles. Just until she could see the ranch. Then she picked it all back up again. The composure, the practicality, the quiet pilot-light anger. She was going to need all of it. The ranch appeared as the sun was starting to drop, a cluster of buildings set against a long ridge, substantial and purposeful and slightly forbidding. She could see the main house 2 stories wide, porch serious, and behind it the barn and outbuildings and the dark shapes of cattle in the distance. She sat up straighter. Jed Marsh glanced at her. "First time out west?" "Yes." He nodded, said nothing else. She appreciated that. They pulled into the yard, and a couple of ranch hands came out to take the horses and the trunk, and Emma climbed down from the wagon and stood in the cold air of the yard and looked at the house. The door opened. House was taller than she had imagined. She wasn't sure why she'd imagined shorter, perhaps, because the letter had made him sound compact, efficient, a man of necessary minimum. But Nathan Harrison filled a doorway. Broad through the shoulders, trail lean, everywhere else. Dark-haired, going gray at the temples. A face that the rancher on the train had been right about. Hard wasn't quite the word. It was more like closed, like a book shut firmly and set on a shelf. He stood on the porch and looked at her. She stood in the yard and looked at him. The cold wind moved between them. And then he said it quietly, almost to himself. but she heard it clearly in the still winter air, heard it with the particular sharpness of a person who has been bracing for exactly this kind of blow. "Who are you?" Emma's breath caught. She had prepared for many things. She had prepared for coldness, for formality, for the clipped efficiency that the letter and the rancher and Jed Marsh had all in their different ways warned her about. She had prepared for a man who would look at her and see a transaction. She had not prepared for a man who looked at her and didn't see who she was supposed to be at all. Emma Carter. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of her voice. You're intended. From Boston." Nathan Harrison looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that doesn't fit the space it's supposed to fit. Assessing, frowning slightly, trying to recalculate. "You're 18. "Yes." "Hollis said you were—" He stopped. "What did Hollis say I was?" His jaw shifted. "He said you were capable." "I am capable." "He didn't say you were—" He stopped again a second time, and Emma would wonder later what word he'd almost said. Young. Small. Unexpected. She was never quite sure. What he said instead after the pause was, "Come inside. You must be cold." Inside the house. Emma met the children. She heard them before she saw them, a thump from upstairs, then running footsteps. Then a small body appeared at the top of the staircase, stopped, looked down at her. A boy. Dark-haired like his father, with his father's stillness, but not yet his father's closed-off quality. He was watching her with a frankness that was almost confrontational. "Is that her, Tommy?" Nathan Harrison's voice carried a specific weight of warning. Tommy came down the stairs with the deliberate casualness of a 9-year-old who has decided to appear not to care about something he cares about intensely. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom and looked Emma over with judicial eyes. "You're not what I expected." Emma looked up at him. "What did you expect?" "Someone older." "I'm 18. Pause 34. "I'm aware." Tommy chewed on this information. "Do you know how to cook?" "Yes." "Our last housekeeper burned everything. I don't burn things." Tommy looked at her for another moment, then transferred his gaze to his father with an expression that said, "I'm withholding judgment." A remarkably sophisticated expression for a 9-year-old, Emma thought. Behind him at the top of the stairs, 2 smaller figures had appeared. Emma looked up at them, a girl of about 7, with large, wary eyes, holding the hand of a tiny 4-year-old who was staring down at Emma with her mouth slightly open. "Grace," Nathan said. "Lily, come down." Grace came down carefully, each step deliberate, keeping her eyes on Emma the whole time. Lily came down behind her 1 step at a time, still staring. At the bottom, Grace stopped. She looked at Emma for a long moment. Then she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Are you going to stay?" Something moved in Emma's chest. Something she hadn't expected to feel in this house, in this yard, in this life she hadn't chosen. "That's the plan," Emma said carefully. "The last lady didn't stay," Grace said. "She left after 2 weeks. Emma glanced at Nathan Harrison, who was looking at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "I'm not planning to leave," Emma said. "Do you promise?" Emma looked at this 7-year-old girl who had lost her mother 18 months ago and had apparently watched at least one other woman decide Wyoming wasn't worth staying for, and she made a decision. "I promise." It was the most reckless thing she had done since boarding the train. Nathan Harrison showed her the house with the efficiency of a man conducting a military briefing. Kitchen here, pantry, there, root cellar through that door, and be careful of the step. Parlor. His study, which she would not need to enter. Upstairs 3 rooms, the children in the big room at the front, her room at the back. His room was... He paused at the end of the hall. They were not sharing a room. He said this with the directness of a man who has decided that some things are better clarified immediately. Emma said she understood. He said dinner was usually at 6. She said she would need to know where things were in the kitchen. He led her back downstairs and went through the pantry with her, and this was the most words he'd said in one stretch, where the flour was, where the dried beans were, where the good knife was kept, and why, and Emma listened and watched and paid attention, because she was going to need to know all of this. When they were done, he stood in the kitchen looking at her with that assessing expression, and she stood in the kitchen looking at him, and she could see him recalibrating. She was younger than he'd been told to expect. She was female and alone and 18 and had just traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. And he was, she thought, possibly realizing for the first time what that had cost her. Or perhaps he was just realizing that she wasn't going to dissolve. You should rest. We'll talk tomorrow about what's needed. Emma looked at him steadily. Mr. Harrison, I would prefer to start now if it's the same to you. Resting won't help me understand what this house needs. Watching it run will. He looked at her. I'm not here to be comfortable. I'm here to be useful, and I'd like to get started. The silence stretched. Something shifted in his face, some small, almost imperceptible change, the kind of change that you only catch if you are very good at watching people, which Emma was. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't even approval, not exactly. It was more like recalibration. All right, Nathan Harrison said. Then come help with supper. She stayed in the kitchen for 2 hours that first evening, and in that time she learned 3 things about Nathan Harrison. The first was that he moved through his own house like a man who had learned not to take up too much room in it, which told her something about grief, and something about guilt, and something about the specific ache of being large in a space where someone smaller used to be. The second was that his children watched him constantly, the way animals watch weather, reading him for information about whether the day was safe. Tommy, especially that 9-year-old boy, had made a study of his father. The third was that when Lily, the 4-year-old, fell asleep against the kitchen wall waiting for supper, and Nathan Harrison picked her up without a word and carried her to bed. He was so gentle that Emma had to look away. A hard man, the rancher on the train had said. Hard as they come. Emma thought not all the way through. Not all the way. After supper, after the children were in bed, Nathan Harrison sat at the kitchen table across from Emma with 2 cups of coffee and the first real conversation they had attempted. It was not easy. It was not comfortable. It was 2 strangers with almost nothing in common except a legal arrangement, and 3 children trying to figure out if they could manage to be useful to each other. He asked about her skills. She listed them without false modesty. She could cook, manage a household, keep accounts, teach basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, and had some knowledge of medicine from her reading. He asked about her health. She said she was healthy. He asked if she knew how to ride. She said no, but she could learn. He said she'd need to. She said she'd start tomorrow. He looked at her for a moment. You're not what I expected. So I've been told. I expected. He seemed to search for the word. Softer. Emma wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I was raised to be useful, she said. I don't know that that leaves much room for soft. Another silence. He was looking at her with that measuring look, and she thought, he's deciding something. She didn't know what. She waited. The arrangement, he said carefully. I want to be honest with you about what I understood it to be. I understood it to be practical. A woman to manage this house and care for my children. I wasn't... He paused. I wasn't looking for anything else. Emma looked at him directly. Nor was I looking to offer it. I wasn't consulted about this arrangement, Mr. Harrison. My father made it for his own reasons, and I am here because I had no good alternatives. That doesn't mean I'm not capable or committed or prepared to do everything this house and these children need. She set her cup down. But I want to be equally honest, I am a person, not an arrangement, and I'd like to be treated accordingly. The silence after this was very long. Nathan Harrison looked at her for what felt like a full minute. Fair enough. 2 words. But she heard in them something she hadn't expected to find in this house on this first impossible night. She heard the beginning of respect. Emma picked up her coffee cup. Nathan Harrison picked up his. Outside, the Wyoming wind was beginning to rise, pushing against the walls of the house, testing them. Inside, the fire in the kitchen stove sent its warmth into the room, and 2 strangers sat across a table from each other and began carefully the slow and uncertain work of learning what they were to each other. It was not love. It was not trust. It was not even yet comfort. But it was a beginning. And Emma Carter, who had boarded a train 4 days ago with her fear folded up small and her anger kept low, Like a pilot light thought, this is what I have. A beginning. A hard man who said fair enough. 3 children who need a mother. 3,000 acres of Wyoming winter. She had been sold. She had been shipped. She had been stood in a yard and looked at like livestock. But she was here now, and she was herself, and she was not going to waste that. She would be more than a transaction. She had decided this on the train, and she decided it again now sitting in Nathan Harrison's kitchen with the wind at the walls and the fire in the stove and the particular quiet of a house where children were sleeping. She would be more than he expected. More than her father had thought to value. More than a settlement of debts. She would be Emma Carter, and she would be extraordinary. And this frozen corner of Wyoming was going to have to make room for her, starting at 5 o'clock the next morning, when she was already in the kitchen with the stove lit and the coffee on, before Nathan Harrison's boots hit the floor upstairs. He came down and stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up from the pan. "Coffee's ready. Eggs in 10 minutes. A pause. "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to." She cracked a third egg into the pan. "I wanted to know how the stove behaves in the morning. Now I know. It runs hot on the left side. I'll adjust." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him standing in the doorway, recalibrating again that same process she had watched start the night before. Then he crossed to the table and sat down, and she heard the specific sound of a man who has decided not to argue with something that is working. Good, Emma thought. That's a start. Tommy came down at 5:30, already dressed, boots, laced hair not quite tamed, and stopped short when he saw Emma at the stove. "You're up," he said. "I am." "Early." "Yes." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from his father, with the studied nonchalance of a boy who has decided to observe without committing to an opinion. Emma set a plate in front of Nathan, then one in front of Tommy, and Tommy looked down at the eggs and the thick-cut bread and the small dish of preserves she'd found in the pantry, and something in his face flickered. Surprise quickly suppressed. He ate without saying thank you, but he ate everything which Emma decided to count as the same thing. Grace and Lily came down together. Grace holding Lily's hand on the stairs, with a care that spoke of long practice. Grace looked at the table, and then at Emma, and something in those 7-year-old eyes did a quiet calculation. "You made breakfast," Grace said. "I did." "Mrs. Harmon didn't make breakfast. She made us get our own." Nathan Harrison set his coffee cup down with a sound that wasn't quite comment. Emma pulled out a chair for Lily and lifted her into it. "Well, I make breakfast. Sit down, Grace." Grace sat. Lily reached immediately for the preserves and knocked the dish sideways, and grabbed it before it fell with a reflex that suggested this was not her first encounter with the preserves dish. She looked up at Emma, with round, waiting eyes braced for the reaction. Emma righted the dish. "Careful with that. It's the last of the strawberry." Lily let out a breath. A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, shy and startled like a rabbit that had been expecting a fox. Emma looked away before Lily could see that she'd noticed. Across the table, Nathan Harrison was watching her. She could feel it. She didn't meet his eyes. After breakfast, he pushed back from the table and said, "I'll show you the horses today. You said you wanted to learn to ride." "I do. It's not easy." "I didn't expect it to be." He almost said something else. She could see it, the beginning of a caution, a warning, something paternal that he stopped himself from saying, because she was not his child, and he had apparently already understood that she didn't want to be managed. He picked up his hat instead and said, "1 hour, after the morning work." Emma nodded. She turned to the sink. She was smiling just slightly where he couldn't see her. That was the second morning. By the fourth, she had a rhythm. Up before light. Fire, coffee, breakfast. Children dressed, fed, settled with their morning lessons. She had taken this over immediately, firmly, without asking permission, pulling out her books and setting the table in the parlor, and establishing with the pleasant implacability of someone who has decided how things are going to be, that from 8 to 10 o'clock every morning, Tommy would do his sums and his reading. Grace would work on her letters and her numbers, and Lily would sit with a picture book and be read to for as long as she'd allow, which turned out to be considerably longer than anyone expected. Tommy resisted on day 1. He sat across the parlor table from Emma with his arms crossed and his jaw set and said he didn't need schooling. He needed to help with the cattle. The men needed him. He was practically grown. "You're 9, Emma said pleasantly. "Almost 10. When you're 10, we'll revisit. Sums first." "Pa doesn't make me do sums." "I'm not your pa. Sums." He glared at her with everything he had, and she met it calmly, and after a long moment of calculating whether this was a battle he could win, he unfolded his arms and picked up his pencil. Not graciously, but he picked it up. Emma moved on to Grace, who was easier, not because Grace was less stubborn, but because Grace was desperately hungry for attention, in a way that she tried to conceal and couldn't quite. She learned faster than Emma had expected, and the hunger she brought to a new word or a solved addition problem was the hunger of a child who has been going without for a long time. That hit Emma somewhere deep, somewhere she didn't examine while Grace was watching. By day 5, Tommy had stopped fighting the lessons. He still pretended to resent them. He had a 9-year-old boy's dignity to maintain, but she caught him twice doing extra problems she hadn't assigned. She said nothing about this, but she noted it. The riding lesson on day 4 nearly killed her. Not literally, but she came off the horse twice, landed hard in the frozen dirt both times, and sat on the ground the second time, breathing carefully through her nose while every bone in her spine registered its opinion of Wyoming. Jed Marsh, who was supervising, said, "You all right?" Emma stood up. "Yes, let's go again." From the fence where he had absolutely not intended to watch and had been watching for 20 minutes, Nathan Harrison said nothing. But when she finally brought the horse to a stop and dismounted, with something approaching control, she heard him tell Jed to give her the gray mare tomorrow. The gray mare apparently was easier. Emma chose to interpret this not as doubt, but as pragmatism, and pragmatism she could work with. By the end of the first week, she had mapped the kitchen, begun the lessons, established the morning routine, introduced the concept of a set bedtime, which Tommy contested loudly and then accepted with bad grace, and which produced an immediate and visible improvement in everyone's morning temperament, and started learning to identify which cattle were which by the markings Nathan described at dinner. She was learning the language of this place. She was determined to be fluent in it. What she hadn't solved was Nathan Harrison. He was courteous. Consistently, carefully, almost formulaically courteous. He thanked her for meals, answered her questions about the ranch, without impatience, explained what she needed to know, without condescension. He was by every observable measure behaving exactly as the letter had promised, treating her with appropriate respect. And he was completely comprehensively closed. She had given up after the third evening on expecting conversation at dinner. He ate, he listened to the children. Tommy. Mostly, he answered questions. He gave instructions for the following day. He did not volunteer. He did not offer. The study remained shut. Whatever he did in there in the evenings, she could hear the scratch of a pen, sometimes the creak of the chair, and she understood that it was the room he went to be himself, the room where he did not have to be observed. She respected this. She was herself a person who understood the need for a room of one's own. But she watched the children watching him, and she saw what they needed, what they had been needing for 18 months, and probably longer, and she thought something has to give somewhere eventually. She just wasn't sure if she was the person who could move it. Then came the incident with Tommy and the fence. It was day 9. Emma was in the kitchen making the midday meal when she heard the shouting, not panic, more like anger, the specific raised voice of male confrontation, and then the back door opened, and Nathan Harrison came in with Tommy by the collar of his coat, and Tommy's face was a controlled storm of furious tears being held back by pure 9-year-old pride. Nathan let go of the collar. "Tell her." Tommy was silent. "Tell her what you did." More silence, and Emma could see that Tommy was not going to speak. Not with that expression. Not with whatever had happened, still hot inside him. She looked at Nathan. What happened? He took down 40 feet of fence line in the north pasture, by himself, without telling anyone. 2 heifers got through into Crane's land before Jed caught them. Emma looked at Tommy. Why? And this was the thing. This was why she asked, because she had already figured out that Tommy Harrison did not do things without reasons. He was 9 years old, and he had his father's closed face and his father's need to not explain himself, but underneath both of those things, he had a mind that worked. Tommy looked at the floor. Tommy. Her voice was not harsh, just steady. Why? The post was rotten, he said, finally, his voice thick. Third post from the gate. It's been rotten for a month. I told Jed and Jed said he'd get to it. He didn't get to it, so he swallowed. I was going to fix it. Nathan started to say something. Emma held up one hand, just slightly, just enough, and he stopped. She wasn't sure which of them was more surprised by this. Where'd you get the tools? She asked Tommy. Barn, I know where everything is. Do you know how to set a new post? A pause. I've watched. But you've never done it. Silence, which was answer enough. Here's what I think happened, Emma said. You saw a problem. You wanted to fix it. You didn't tell your father because you wanted to do it yourself. She paused. Is that right? Tommy's jaw worked. He nodded once very slightly. Those are not bad instincts. Seeing problems and wanting to fix them, that's rancher's thinking. Your father does that. You've learned it by watching him. She let that sit for a moment. But you pulled down 40 feet of fence to get to one post, and now there are 2 heifers on someone else's land and a gap in the north pasture in January, because you didn't ask for help. Tommy looked up. Something had shifted in his face. The shame was still there, but the fury had changed shape. Next time. Emma said, come to me first, or Jed, or your father. One of us will help you learn to do it right. Can you do that? A long pause. Yes, ma'am, Tommy said. It was the first time he had called her that. She didn't remark on it. She looked at Nathan. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite the recalibration look, something more than that. Something that had less armor in it. After lunch, Nathan said to Tommy, his voice quieter than before. You'll come with me and Jed and we'll fix the fence together. You'll do the post work. I'll show you how. Tommy blinked. Really? You wanted to learn it, so learn it right. Tommy looked at his father for a moment, and something happened between them. Something Emma felt she was witnessing from a careful distance. A door slightly opened. Then Tommy turned and went to wash his hands for lunch, and Nathan Harrison looked at Emma, and she looked back, and he said quietly, Thank you. He's got good instincts. Don't waste them. Something moved across Nathan Harrison's face that she thought might be the beginning of a smile. No, he agreed. I won't. That was day 9, and something shifted after it. Not dramatically, nothing about Nathan Harrison moved dramatically, she was coming to understand. He was a man of increments of small adjustments of things decided quietly and never announced. But something shifted nonetheless. He started talking at dinner. Not much, not effortlessly, not the way a naturally open man talks, but real talk, substantive talk, ranch business and weather patterns, and the political maneuvering in Cheyenne that was affecting cattle prices. He asked her opinions occasionally. She gave them, and he listened, and sometimes she could see him putting what she said somewhere inside, filing it away. He asked about Boston once cautiously, as if the question cost him something. What was it like? He meant not the city exactly, but the life. Growing up there. What her mother had been like. Emma answered carefully, briefly, because some things were still folded up small, and she wasn't ready to unfold them in front of this man in this kitchen. But she answered, and he listened, and afterward she asked him about his wife without planning to. She regretted it immediately. She saw the change in him, not anger, nothing as active as that, but a closing as if shutters had come down behind his eyes. Her name was Clara, he said. That was all. Emma didn't push. She was not a woman who pushed. But later that night, after the children were in bed, she was coming down the stairs, and she passed the door of his study, and through it, she heard something she hadn't expected to hear. The particular very careful silence of a man who has picked something up and is holding it, and she thought it was a photograph, though she never confirmed this, because she did not stop, because some things belong to the people who carry them and cannot be borrowed. She went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and sat with it in the dark, and she thought about Clara Harrison, 18 months in the ground, and about 3 children who had learned to read their father's face for weather, and about a man who had arranged to replace what he'd lost with something practical. Because the alternative, the real alternative, the one where you loved someone and lost them and tried to survive it, was apparently too much to face directly. She thought, I am not a replacement. I need to make sure he knows that. She thought, but all this family is in pain. Real pain. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that goes around doing ranch work and eating dinner and pretending to be functional while underneath it, something is slowly bleeding out. She thought, I don't know how to fix that. I don't know if it's mine to fix. But she was here, and she was going to stay. So she finished her tea and she went to bed. And in the morning she got up at 5 o'clock and lit the stove. And it was day 11, and Tommy did his sums without being told. It was day 12 when Jed Marsh told her about Victor Crane. She was in the yard, bringing grain to the horses. She had added this to her morning routine because the horses needed feeding and she needed riding practice, and doing both at once was efficient. When Jed fell into step beside her, with the easy companionship of a man who has decided quietly to accept someone. You settling in all right? He asked. Better every day. He nodded. The children like you. I hope so. I like them. Grace hasn't talked this much since... He stopped himself. In a while. Emma let that sit. She's a smart girl. She is. Jed was quiet for a moment. I want to tell you something. About this area. Things you should know. Emma looked at him. All right. There's a man, Jed said. Victor Crane. He has the land east of ours and the land north, and he's been buying up everything between here and the Laramie River for the past 2 years. Any ranch that goes under any widow who can't manage any man who gets squeezed hard enough. Crane buys the land usually for less than it's worth. He paused. He's been pushing at Mr. Harrison for 8 months. Emma kept her voice level. What kind of pushing? Water disputes, fence line arguments. Last spring he redirected a creek that runs through our north pasture, said it was on his land, which it isn't, and it took 3 months and a lawyer to settle it. Lost water for 90 days in spring. He paused. He made an offer on the ranch in September. Mr. Harrison turned it down. And since then, Jed's expression was careful. Since then it's been quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Crane doesn't stay quiet when he wants something. Emma absorbed this. Why are you telling me? Jed looked at her directly. Because you need to know the whole of it, and because... He paused, choosing his words. Mr. Harrison doesn't talk about it much. He carries it himself. Has since Clara died, maybe before. But the truth is, Crane has been circling this place for a long time, and a man alone, even a man as capable as Nathan Harrison, is a different thing from a man with someone beside him who knows what's happening. Emma thought about this for a moment. Then she said, Thank you, Jed. He nodded once and went back to the barn, and Emma stood in the cold air with the grain bucket in her hands and thought about Victor Crane, and about water rights, and about the specific kind of man who waited for other men to be worn down before moving in. She thought Nathan Harrison needs to know I know, and he needs to decide if he trusts me enough to tell me himself. She went back inside and said nothing about it. She watched instead. She watched Nathan come in from the north pasture that afternoon, with the particular tight-jawed expression of a man who has seen something that troubles him and is deciding whether to act. She watched him sit at dinner and answer the children's questions and eat his meal and say nothing about whatever he had seen. After dinner. After the children were in bed, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. Jed told me about Crane. Very long pause. Did he? Not a question. He thought I should know the situation. Nathan wrapped his hands around the cup. She watched him decide, watched the brief internal war of a man who does not want to put weight on other people's shoulders, and a man who is beginning to understand that this particular person might be able to carry some. Crane made a move today. Pulled the markers on the southeast corner of our property, moved them 300 feet onto our land. Emma's eyes didn't widen. She kept her voice even. Can you prove it? I have the survey from 1879. Yes. Does he know you have it? He knows. Then he's not doing this because he thinks he can win a legal argument, Emma said. He's doing it to cost you time and money and attention. He wants you managing a dispute while he works on something else. Nathan looked at her, really looked at her. That's exactly right. What else is he working on? A pause. I don't know yet. Then we need to find out. She said it naturally, easily, and she heard it as it landed and didn't take it back. She meant it. This was her house now, her family now, and if something was circling it, she was not going to sit in the kitchen and wait to be told. Nathan Harrison set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said slowly, when Hollis Greer told me he had a match for me, I told him I needed someone capable. So I've heard. I didn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't think through what that would actually mean. Having someone capable. Emma waited. It means that they do things, think things, act on things. It's not the same as having someone quiet and obedient in the house. No, Emma agreed. It isn't. Something almost happened in his face then. Almost. Is that a problem? She asked quietly. He looked at her for a long time, and she held the look, and the kitchen was warm, and the house was quiet, and outside the Wyoming wind was pressing against the walls again, testing them the way it did every night. No, Nathan Harrison said. It's not a problem. And he picked up his coffee cup, and she picked up hers, and they sat at the table until the fire burned low, going over what they knew about Victor Crane, and what they didn't, and what needed to happen next. It was, Emma thought, the first real conversation they had ever had. Not the careful courtesy of the first week. Not the transactional exchange of information about ranch schedules and children's needs. This was two people thinking together, planning together, each one bringing something the other didn't have. He had the knowledge of the land and the history of the dispute. She had the particular clarity of someone who had spent her whole life watching how power worked in rooms where she wasn't supposed to matter. They talked for 2 hours. When they finally said goodnight and she went upstairs, she was almost at her room when she heard Nathan's voice behind her in the hallway, quiet and not quite comfortable, but real, Emma. She turned. He was standing at the end of the hall, and he looked not soft, never soft, but less armored. Like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just for a moment put it down. I'm glad you're here. I wanted you to know that. Emma looked at him for a moment. Good night, Nathan. She went to her room and shut the door and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and the pilot light that she had carried all the way from Boston. That quiet, sustaining anger at being sold, at being shipped, at being arranged, flickered. It didn't go out, but it changed. Shifted slightly the way fire shifts when the wind changes direction. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the dark and thought, I am here because I had no choice. But I am going to stay because I am choosing to. And that is a different thing entirely. Outside, the wind rose and fell against the walls of the Harrison Ranch, and inside, in 3 separate rooms, 4 people who had all in their different ways been managing loss for a very long time, slept. And somewhere in the east, in a large house on land that was not yet large enough, Victor Crane was also awake, also planning, also watching, and he had no idea yet that the woman who had arrived on Nathan Harrison's ranch 2 weeks ago was going to be the thing that changed the calculation entirely. But he was learning fast. The first sign came 3 days later, and Emma almost missed it. She was outside with Grace, working on letters in the dirt with a stick, the way she'd started doing when the parlor got too restless. Grace learned better with her hands moving. Emma had figured that out by day 6, when a rider came through the gate at a pace that was too deliberate to be casual and too slow to be urgent. He wore a coat she didn't recognize and sat his horse like a man who had been sent to be seen. He didn't stop at the house. He rode a slow loop through the yard, looked at the barn, looked at the outbuildings, looked at Emma and Grace in the dirt, and rode back out. Grace didn't look up from her letters. Emma watched him go. Great, she said carefully. Have you seen that man before? Grace pressed her stick into the dirt and drew a careful G. He comes sometimes, him and others. They ride through and look at things. When did they start doing that? Grace thought about it with the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old reconstructing time. Before Mama died. Maybe after. I don't remember exactly. Emma filed this away. She finished the lesson, brought Grace inside, and went to find Jed. Jed was in the barn, and when she described the rider, he set down what he was holding. That's one of Crane's men. Owen Doyle. He does this every couple weeks. Reconnaissance is what it amounts to. Riding through the yard is reconnaissance. Crane likes to know what he's dealing with. Jed paused. Used to just be the land he was watching. The acreage, the water access, where the fence lines ran. But since... He stopped. Since Clara died, Emma said. Jed looked at her, nodded. He started watching the house more after that, watching whether Nathan could manage alone. He paused. He nearly couldn't for a while. First 6 months where it was hard. 3 children, winter, no help. Crane came close to making a move then, I think. But Nathan held. Emma thought about Nathan Harrison holding this ranch together alone for 18 months, and she thought about what that kind of holding cost a person, and she thought about Victor Crane watching from the east and waiting for the moment when the cost became too high. He's going to make a move soon. Not a legal one this time. Jed looked at her carefully. What makes you say that? Because Doyle came through and looked at the house specifically. Not the fence lines, not the pasture, the house. She paused. He's changed his target. Jed was quiet for a long moment. You should tell Nathan. I will, tonight. But Nathan came home that evening with something already wrong in his face, that closed weather-reading expression that the children immediately responded to, going quieter at dinner. Tommy watching from under his brows. Emma watched Nathan move through the meal and the evening and thought he already knows something. He just isn't saying it. After the children were in bed, she didn't wait for coffee this time. She sat down across from him at the table and said, "What happened today?" He looked at her. Doyle came through the yard. I saw him. I told Grace to keep drawing her letters and I watched him ride his loop. What else? A pause. I went to town this afternoon, saw my lawyer. Nathan set both hands flat on the table. Crane has filed a claim with the land office in Cheyenne. He says the water rights on the North Creek were originally registered to a company he bought out 4 years ago. If the claim holds, we lose the creek. Emma's stomach tightened. She kept her voice level. Does the claim have merit? My lawyer says maybe 10%. The registration is old and the paperwork is muddy. But Crane has connections in Cheyenne, and 10% of a muddy claim is enough to tie it up in hearings for months, maybe a year. A year without the North Creek. We can't run this operation a year without that water, not at full capacity. His jaw was tight. He knows that. What does your lawyer recommend? Fight it. But it costs money to fight it, and Crane knows that too. He stopped. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to drain us dry until we sell. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he's running 2 attacks at once. The legal claim to cost you money and attention. The yard visits to measure whether you're weakening. She looked at Nathan directly. And he thinks you're alone. Nathan looked at her. He hasn't adjusted his calculation, Emma said since I arrived. Has he? Slow realization moved across Nathan's face. He'd have heard about you. Word gets around. He'd have heard that your arranged wife arrived from Boston, a young woman from the city with no knowledge of ranching. Emma's voice was even. He doesn't think that changes anything. Does it? Nathan said it quietly, and it wasn't a challenge. It was a real question. That depends on what we do next, Emma said. But yes, it does. She told him then what she'd been thinking since Jed's conversation. Thinking carefully, putting it together, the way she put together lessons for Tommy and Grace, finding the logic of it. Crane's strategy was attrition. He was a patient man. She thought a man who preferred to win without fighting, which meant he was afraid of a direct confrontation he might lose. The legal claim wasn't a weapon. It was a stall. Something to keep Nathan looking one direction, while Crane positioned himself in another. What direction? Nathan said. I don't know yet, but there's something we're not seeing. She paused. Is there anything on this land besides the cattle and the water? Anything he might want that isn't obvious? Nathan was still. A very specific kind of still. Not the stillness of a man who doesn't know the answer, but the stillness of a man deciding whether to say it. "There's coal," he said finally. Emma waited. 3 years ago, I had a man out here, geologist, looking at some outcroppings on the south ridge. He said there's a seam runs under the south quarter of the property. Significant size. Nathan's voice was careful. I never did anything with it. Clara was sick by then, and I had other things on my mind. I never filed the mineral claim. The silence between them had weight now. Does Crane know about the coal? Emma asked. I don't know. The geologist he wasn't local. I don't think he talked. But Nathan's voice had an uncertainty in it now. I don't know. If Crane knows about the coal, Emma said slowly, then the water rights claim isn't about the water at all. It's about accessing the South Ridge. If he controls the North Creek, he controls your ability to run enough cattle to stay solvent. And if you can't stay solvent, I sell. Nathan's voice had gone flat. And when I sell, he files the mineral claim. And makes 10 times what he paid you for this ranch. They looked at each other across the table, and the fire burned low in the stove, and outside the wind moved through the dark, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because some things need a moment of silence before you can start working on them. We need to file the mineral claim, Emma said. Your claim, before Crane does. I need the geologist's report. He stopped, stood up, went to his study. Emma waited at the table. She heard drawers opening, papers moving, the particular controlled urgency of a man searching for something he hopes is where he left it. He came back with a folded paper and spread it on the table between them. She leaned in. The report was 3 years old, technical, dense, with language she didn't entirely know, but the key points were clear enough. The seam location, the estimated depth, the quality assessment. She read it twice. This is enough to file on, she asked. My lawyer says yes. I kept putting it off. He said it without apology, just as fact, but she heard in it the specific exhaustion of a man who had been managing too much alone for too long. There was always something more immediate. Then we file Monday, Emma said. First thing. Nathan looked at her. I'll come with you to Cheyenne. You shouldn't do it alone if Crane has eyes in the land office, and I suspect he does. He needs to see that there are 2 of us managing this. She paused. A young woman from Boston is less threatening to him than the reality of what I'm actually doing here. Let him underestimate me. That's useful. Nathan Harrison looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face now was something she hadn't seen there before. Not recalibration, not the cautious respect of the past 2 weeks. Something more direct than that. Something that saw her. All right. Monday. They rode to Cheyenne on Monday, and they filed the mineral claim. And Crane's man, she spotted him in the land office lobby, pretending to read notices, went pale when he saw the document, and then paler when he saw Emma sign her name on this supporting declaration, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had been making difficult decisions her whole life. On the way home in the wagon, Nathan said almost to himself, I should have done that 3 years ago. You were managing other things, Emma said. He was quiet. Then, Clara was sick. I wasn't thinking about coal. You were thinking about her? Yes. Emma kept her eyes on the road ahead. That's not a failing, Nathan. He didn't respond, but his hands on the reins loosened slightly, and she thought that was something. The filing bought them time, but it also, she understood, lit a fire under Victor Crane. The period of attrition was over. If Crane wanted the coal, and he did, she was now certain he needed to move before the claim was processed and locked, which meant the next move would come fast. She told Jed to double the watch on the north pasture. She told Tommy as casually as she could that she wanted him to stay within sight of the house for the next week, which Tommy received with suspicion, and then with something grudging that was almost compliance, when she explained simply that she had a bad feeling, and she trusted her bad feelings. Do you really? Tommy said. I do. He thought about this. Pa says feelings aren't ranching. Your pay also walks the whole fence line himself every morning, even though he has men for it, Emma said. That's a feeling. He calls it being thorough. Same thing. Tommy's mouth twitched. He stayed within sight of the house. The thing she hadn't planned for was that Crane would move in the night and that he would move against Tommy specifically. She woke at 3 in the morning to Lily screaming. Not crying, screaming the high raw sound of a 4-year-old in genuine terror, and Emma was out of bed and across the hall before she was fully awake, her mind already running through possibilities, her hands reaching for Lily in the dark. Lily was sitting up in bed, shaking, pointing at the window. Grace was beside her white-faced arms around her sister. There were men, Grace said. Her voice was very quiet. Outside the window. I saw them from the bed. Emma looked at the window, looked at the bed beside Lily's where Tommy slept. The bed was empty. She moved before she thought out the door and to the top of the stairs and down her mind doing the terrible arithmetic of how long it had been, how far they could have gotten what they wanted. And on the stairs, she nearly ran into Nathan Harrison coming up his boots on his rifle in his hand, his face a mask of controlled alarm. Tommy's gone, she said. He stopped. 1 second. The mask cracked. Underneath it was something she had never seen on Nathan Harrison's face and hoped never to see again, pure animal fear. A father's fear. The kind that has no armor in it. How long ago? His voice was steady, but she heard what it cost him. Grace saw men at the window. I don't know. Emma turned back to the girls' room. Grace, the men outside. How many did you see? Grace had followed to the doorway, Lily still pressed against her. 2, maybe 3. They had Tommy's arm. She swallowed. He didn't look awake. Nathan was already moving down the stairs. Emma turned to Grace. Lock this door after me. Don't open it for anyone except your father or me. Understand? Grace's face was white and absolutely certain. Yes. Emma went after Nathan. Howe was in the yard, and Jed was already there. Jed slept in the bunkhouse closest to the house. She hadn't known this until now, but she understood it instantly as deliberate a choice Nathan had made sometime in the past 18 months, and they were already moving toward the barn, voices low and rapid. 3 horses gone, Jed was saying. They took 3 horses, which means they had at least 3 men. They went north, Nathan said. He said it with certainty, and Emma understood that he had already processed it. North meant Crane's land. Crane's territory somewhere on 3,000 acres of hostile ground. They're not going to hurt him, Emma said. She said it clearly, not gently. She was not being gentle right now, she was being useful. Crane doesn't want a murder charge, he wants leverage. Tommy is leverage. Nathan stopped. He turned to look at her, and she saw it again. That fear, and underneath the fear, something else. A man who is 5 seconds from making a decision based on emotion rather than strategy. And she could not let him do that, because Crane would be waiting for exactly that. Listen to me. He took Tommy because he wants you to ride north without thinking. He has men waiting. You go up there alone and angry, and they'll take you too. Or worse. And then there's no one left to file injunctions or protect this property or raise those 2 girls upstairs. She held his eyes. So you don't go alone, and you don't go angry. You go smart. Nathan Harrison looked at her for a very long moment. He's 9 years old. His voice was very controlled and very quiet. I know. He's my son. I know, which is exactly why you're going to think before you move. She turned to Jed. Who do we have riders right now who we trust absolutely? Jed ran the count without hesitation. Me, Pete Dawson, Cal Reyes, Matt Hurd, 4 men plus Nathan. 5 men, Emma said. Are they armed? Always. Get them. She turned to Nathan. Crane will send a message before dawn. He'll tell you what he wants. We wait for the message and we use it. We don't wait, Nathan said. And it wasn't argument. It was the flat truth of a man telling her where his line was. I will hear what he wants, but Tommy is out of there before morning. Emma met his eyes. Yes. He is. I'm telling you how. She went inside. She went to Nathan's study, the room she had never entered, and she found what she needed. The land survey, the geological report, a folder of correspondence. She read rapidly. and a second folder. She almost missed, pushed to the back of a shelf which contained 3 letters from a lawyer in Cheyenne that had nothing to do with Crane. She read those letters standing in the study in the lamplight, and what she found in them stopped her breath for a moment. Then she put them back exactly as she'd found them, and she went to the kitchen, and she made coffee, and she thought. The message came at 4:30 in the morning, delivered by a rider who came to the gate and called out, and did not come closer. Jed brought the note inside. Nathan read it. His face said nothing. He passed it to Emma. "Mr. Harrison, I have something of yours. I would like something of yours in return. Sign the southeast quarter to me, and I will see the boy returned by noon. You have until sunrise. If I don't hear from you, the boy, and I will take a ride to Cheyenne to discuss the mineral claim filing with some friends at the land office. They are very interested in the chain of title on that particular seam. V. Crane." Emma set the note on the table. "He doesn't know about the letters." Nathan looked at her. "What letters?" She met his eyes. "The letters in your study. The ones from Mr. Aldrich in Cheyenne, about the original land grant." A pause, long enough to be significant. "You went into my study. I needed the survey maps, and I found them." She kept her voice even. "I'm sorry for the intrusion, but Nathan, those letters matter. Right now they matter very much." She paused. "The original grant documentation in those letters, the one your father filed in 1868, it lists the mineral rights as explicitly attached to the land title. Inalienable. Crane cannot separate them no matter who he talks to in Cheyenne. His claim, if he files one, is fraudulent on its face." Nathan was very still. "It is also," Emma said carefully, "the kind of fraud that the territorial governor has been actively investigating for the past year and a half. I read about it in the Cheyenne papers. Land fraud in the mineral registry. 3 prosecutions already this year." Nathan looked at the note from Crane. He looked at Emma. "How do you know about the governor's investigations?" "I read everything," she said simply. "I always have." The silence in the kitchen was very full. "If Crane files that claim," Emma said, "he doesn't embarrass you. He hangs himself, but he doesn't know that, and we can use that." Nathan stood up. He was very still, the way a man is still before he moves fast, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and absolute. "Tell me what you're thinking." "We send a reply," Emma said, "not agreeing to his terms, not refusing them either. We tell him we need to meet, face to face. In the morning at the north fence line, his choice of location, so he feels in control." She paused. "While he's waiting for us to show up, Jed takes Pete and Cal around the west side and comes in from behind. Crane will have posted men on the east approach, not the west. He's predictable. He thinks in straight lines. He doesn't know we know this land better than he does." Nathan looked at Jed. Jed said, "She's right about the west approach. There's a draw that runs." "I know the draw," Nathan said. "How long?" "Hour and a half riding careful." "Can you get Tommy out without a fight?" "If we get there before he moves Tommy to a second location, yes. Crane won't be at the holding location himself. He'll be at the fence waiting for you. He always manages from a distance." Jed's voice was certain. "He's a careful man. Careful men put distance between themselves and the dirty work." Nathan turned to Emma. For a moment, just a moment, he looked like a man who wanted to say something that he didn't have the words for. Yet something about what it meant to have someone in this kitchen at 4:30 in the morning who was still thinking clearly when he could barely breathe. He didn't say it, but she saw it. "Write the reply." Emma sat down at the kitchen table and wrote the reply in her best handwriting, polite, and measured the kind of letter a careful Boston woman writes to a frightening man she is pretending not to be afraid of, and every word of it was designed to convince Victor Crane that Nathan Harrison was coming to negotiate. Jed took the letter to the gate. The rider left with it. Then Jed took Pete and Cal and rode out quietly through the south gate, looping wide into the dark. Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway, and Emma stood beside him, and they waited, and the clock on the wall moved through the last hour before dawn with a slowness that was almost unbearable. "He'll be all right," Emma said. "You don't know that," Nathan said. It wasn't harsh. It was just true. "No," she agreed. But I know that Tommy is the kind of boy who pays attention. He knows how to be still when he needs to be." She paused. "He learned that from you." Nathan didn't answer, but his jaw unclenched fractionally. At 6:12 in the morning, they heard hooves in the yard, and Nathan was out the door before Emma could move, and she followed him into the gray dawn light and saw Jed coming through the gate with Pete and Cal, and in front of Jed on the saddle wrapped in someone's coat was Tommy Harrison. I was awake. I was pale. There was a cut above his left eye that had dried to a thin dark line, and when Nathan pulled him off the horse and down into his arms, Tommy made a sound. One sound, just one. The sound of 9 years of held-together composure hitting a wall and buried his face in his father's shoulder. Nathan Harrison held his son in the yard in the cold dawn and didn't say anything, and Emma stood back and watched, and the ache in her chest was so specific and so large that she had to press her hand against it briefly before she trusted herself to move. She went to Tommy instead. She put her hand on his back just briefly, just to let him know she was there. He reached back blindly and grabbed her wrist and held it. She held on. "Is he hurt?" she asked Jed quietly. "Bump on the head and the cut, shaken up. He fought them when they grabbed him, got himself a clip for it." Jed's voice was rough with something he was controlling. "He's all right." Emma exhaled slowly. "And Crane?" Jed's face changed. "Crane was at the fence line when we sent 2 of the boys out to meet him. He understood when they arrived without Nathan that something had gone sideways. He's gone." A pause. For now. Emma filed this away because she was not a woman who forgot the edges of a problem just because the center had been handled. She looked at Nathan still holding Tommy, and she thought, this isn't over. Crane had moved from legal maneuvering to kidnapping a child in a single night, and a man who escalates that fast when he's cornered was not a man who would walk away quietly. He was going to come back harder. She needed to be ready. She went inside and put the kettle on, and she heated water for the cut above Tommy's eye, and she got out the tin of salve she had packed in Boston, that small practical tin she had chosen over something softer, over something sentimental, and she thought, I am glad I packed this. I am glad I packed everything I did. I am glad I am here, and not somewhere comfortable and safe, because this family needed someone to be here. When Nathan brought Tommy inside, the boy submitted to the cleaning of his cut with the stoic endurance of someone who is saving his dignity for later. And when Emma pressed the salve gently to the wound and said, "You're going to be fine," Tommy looked up at her with those dark, assessing eyes. "I know. Then, I wasn't scared." Emma looked at him steadily. "Yes, you were. And that's all right. Being scared and doing the right thing anyway is what courage actually is." Tommy looked at her for a long moment. "How did you know where I was?" he said. "How did you figure it out?" Emma smoothed a piece of clean cloth over the salve. "Grace saw them take you, and I know how men like Crane think." She paused. "And Jed knows this land better than they do." "Were you scared?" Tommy said. She met his eyes. "Yes, I was." Tommy absorbed this, then quietly, "I'm glad you're here, Emma." "Not ma'am." Her name. She pressed the cloth gently to his forehead and held it there, and did not say anything for a moment, because some things are bigger than words. Outside, Nathan Harrison stood in the yard in the growing light and looked east toward Crane's land, and his face had the look of a man who has crossed a line inside himself, a line that separates patience from resolve, endurance from decision. Victor Crane had put his hands on his son, and that calculation, whatever else it contained, was now settled, and Nathan Harrison was the kind of man who once settled on something did not unsettle. Emma saw it in him that morning after Tommy had been cleaned up and fed and put to bed to sleep off the shock. Not the hot, reckless anger she had been afraid of, but something colder and more purposeful. The kind of resolve that doesn't burn itself out quickly because it isn't fire. It's iron. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood and said, "I'm going to end this." "Yes," Emma said. "We are, but we're going to do it in a way that sticks." He looked at her. She could see him wanting to argue, not because he disagreed, but because the part of him that had been carrying this ranch alone for 18 months had not yet fully learned to accept the word "we" from another person without flinching. You have the mineral claim filed, she said. You have the original grant documentation proving the rights are inalienable. What you don't have yet is Crane on record committing the fraud himself. She paused. The kidnapping changes that. That's not a civil matter anymore. That's criminal. He didn't do it himself. He sent men. He sent a written note, signed it himself. Emma tapped the paper still on the table between them. V. Crane. That note is a ransom demand. It references the mineral claim as leverage. That connects the kidnapping directly to the land fraud. She looked at Nathan steadily. That note is worth more than anything else we have. Nathan looked at the note. Something moved in his face, the slow dawn of understanding that the thing he'd been handed in outrage was in fact a weapon. My lawyer. We ride to Cheyenne today. Not tomorrow. Today. Emma stood. And we bring the note, the grant documentation, the geological report, and the correspondence from Aldrich. All of it. We lay it in front of your lawyer, and we let him take it to the territorial prosecutor. Nathan was already pushing back from the table. I'll get the horses. They were on the road to Cheyenne within the hour, and Emma sat beside Nathan on the wagon seat with the leather satchel of documents in her lap, and the cold Wyoming morning pressing around them, and she thought about what came next. Not just today, not just the lawyer's office, but after. What the ranch looked like when Crane was gone. What Nathan Harrison looked like when the weight of that threat was lifted. Whether the door that had opened slightly between them the night Tommy was returned would hold, or whether the urgency of the crisis had made it look wider than it was. She thought about the letters she had found in his study. The ones she hadn't mentioned to Nathan yet, the ones that weren't about Crane at all. She wasn't ready to mention them. Not yet. That conversation was going to require a different kind of courage than anything she had deployed in the past 2 weeks, and she needed to be sure of the ground before she stepped onto it. Nathan's lawyer was a compact, precise man named Gerald Whitmore, who wore his suits as if they were armor and spoke in sentences so carefully constructed they could have been filed in court as written. He read the documents Emma laid before him in order without interruption, and when he finished, he set the ransom note on top of the pile and looked at them both over his glasses. This is quite extraordinary. Can you take it to the prosecutor? Nathan asked. I can do better than that. Whitmore tapped the note. Governor Hoyt has had Victor Crane on a list for 14 months. A list of men his office believes are engaged in systematic mineral claim fraud in this territory. The problem has always been evidence of a specific act connecting the fraud to an individual. He looked at them. This note is that act. Crane signed his own name to a document that explicitly ties a kidnapping to pressure on a mineral rights claim. He paused. Mr. Harrison, I want to take this to the governor's office directly, today, this afternoon. Nathan glanced at Emma. She gave him the smallest nod. Do it, Nathan said. They waited in Whitmore's outer office for 3 hours while he was gone, and Emma sat with the empty satchel in her lap, and Nathan sat beside her, and they didn't talk much, but the silence was different from the silences of 2 weeks ago. It wasn't the silence of two strangers being careful with each other. It was the silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. At one point, Nathan said quietly, "You packed that tin of salve, in Boston." Emma looked at him. Yes. You packed it before you knew anything about this place. I packed practical things. I always do. He was quiet. Then, Tommy would have had to make do with whatever was in the barn, which is turpentine and a prayer. Emma almost smiled. The turpentine would have been character building. Nathan made a sound that was startlingly almost a laugh. It surprised both of them. She saw him register his own surprise, that sound, that particular loosening, and then not pull back from it, which felt significant. Whitmore came back at 3:30 with the look of a man who has just fired a very large gun and is pleased with the trajectory. The governor's office is issuing an arrest warrant for Victor Crane by end of business today, he said, on charges of extortion, conspiracy to commit land fraud, and felony kidnapping. The territorial marshal will execute it. He sat down. Additionally, the fraudulent water rights claim has been flagged for investigation and will be suspended pending review. He looked at Nathan. Your mineral claim stands. Your water rights stand. and Victor Crane by tomorrow morning will be explaining himself to the marshal. Nathan Harrison sat very still for a moment. How long have you been my lawyer? Whitmore blinked. 11 years. In 11 years has anything gone this smoothly? Whitmore almost smiled. No. I'd attribute it to the quality of the evidence. He glanced briefly at Emma. And the quality of the preparation. On the ride home with the sun dropping fast and the cold rising to meet it. Nathan said, I keep thinking I should have done this sooner. Filed the mineral claim, gone to the lawyer with everything at once, not let it drag. You were managing other things, Emma said. Same words she'd said before. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. He was quiet. The horses moved steadily on the frozen road. You found those letters, he said. In my study. Emma waited. The ones from Aldrich. He kept his eyes on the road. There were 3 letters. About the land grant. And there were other letters in that drawer. Very still now, both of them. I didn't read anything I didn't need to read, Emma said carefully. But you saw them. I saw them. Another stretch of road. Another stretch of silence. Clara's letters. It wasn't quite a statement, wasn't quite a question. Yes, Emma said. I saw your name on the top one. I stopped. He drove for a while without speaking, and she let him, because this was not a place you could navigate by being efficient about it. This was a place that required its own pace. I can't read them yet, he said finally. She wrote them when she knew she was. She wrote them that last month. One for each of the children. One for me. He stopped. I've had them for 18 months, and I cannot make myself open the one with my name on it. Emma didn't say anything immediately. She thought about what she wanted to say, and what was useful to say, and whether those were the same thing. That's not weakness, she said at last. That's love. It's still too loud to read past. Nathan's hands on the reins tightened, then deliberately loosened. She would have liked you. It came out with some difficulty, like something carried a long way. Emma felt the weight of it. She didn't deflect it, and she didn't lean into it too far. I would have liked to know her, she said honestly. They drove the rest of the way home mostly in silence, but it was a silence that had been opened up, somehow made more room, and Emma thought, this is the thing you can't arrange for. You can arrange competence and practicality and a capable woman from Boston. You cannot arrange for 2 people to decide together without any plan to let each other in. The ranch was lit up when they came through the gate, every lamp in the main house burning the bunkhouse light on, and Jed standing on the porch with an expression that was specifically not worry, and therefore absolutely worry. Nathan was down from the wagon before it fully stopped. What happened? Nothing bad, Jed said quickly. Nothing, the children are fine. Tommy's up actually, which I tried to prevent and failed because he's your son. He paused. There was a visitor. Crane. No. Man named Doyle. Owen Doyle. Came to the gate alone, no weapons showing, asked to speak with you. Jed's expression was complicated. He talked to me instead. Nathan looked at him hard. And, he's done, Jed said. With Crane. He said he didn't sign on for taking children, and he didn't sign on for land fraud, and he wanted to give a statement. Jed paused. He knows where Crane is tonight, and he knows what Crane is planning to do next, since the warrant will reach him by morning. What is he planning? He's going to run, but not empty-handed. Jed's voice dropped. He's going to burn the north pasture before he goes, take out the grass drive off what cattle he can salt the well on the east line. He looked at Nathan. Leave this place as close to nothing as he can before the marshal gets to him. The silence on the porch was very specific. Emma said, Where is Doyle now? Inside, kitchen. She was already moving. Owen Doyle was a weathered man of about 45, who sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, and the look of someone who has made a decision that cost him and is not asking for a medal for it. He looked up when Emma came in, then looked at Nathan behind her. Mr. Harrison? His voice was flat and tired. Doyle. Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway. You've got something to say. I've got a lot to say. I should have said it sooner. I didn't, and I'm not going to stand here and explain that in a way that makes me look better because there isn't one. He put both hands around the untouched coffee cup. Crane plans to hit the north pasture tonight. He's got 4 men still with him who don't know about the warrant and won't until it's too late. He's going to do the damage and be across the territorial line before morning. Where is he now? Nathan said. Old Pryor Line Shack, 8 miles northeast. Doyle met Nathan's eyes. I'll write it down if your lawyer needs a signed statement. I'll tell the marshal everything I know. I'm done protecting that man's business. Emma looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at her. Why tonight? Emma said to Doyle. Why come now? Doyle looked at her steadily. The boy? I've done a lot of things for Crane over 3 years that I'm not proud of. Fences, water disputes, harassment. I told myself it was just ranching business, just how it works out here. He stopped. But I was there last night, when they grabbed the kid. His jaw shifted. That's not ranching business. That's not anything I'm willing to be part of. Emma held his gaze for a moment. She thought he was telling the truth. She thought it was the kind of truth that had cost him several long hours of sitting with before he'd acted on it, the kind that came with genuine self-accounting rather than convenient remorse. Thank you. She turned to Nathan. We send a writer to Whitmore right now with Doyle's statement. Whitmore gets it to the marshal tonight. The marshal can intercept Crane at the line shack before he moves. Nathan was already looking at Jed. Pete, now. Jed went. Then Nathan turned back to the kitchen. Doyle, you'll stay here tonight. Write out everything you know. He paused, and something careful moved in his voice. And in the morning, if you need work, I'm not opposed to discussing it. Doyle looked up. He hadn't expected that. Why? Because a man who draws a line, Nathan said simply, is more useful to me than a man who doesn't have one. Emma went upstairs to check on the children. Tommy was, as Jed had predicted emphatically, not asleep, sitting up in bed with a book he was clearly not reading, wearing the expression of a boy who has decided to appear casual about being awake at 8 o'clock when he was supposed to be resting. How's your head? Emma asked. Fine. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him. You heard us downstairs? Not a question. He had his father's hearing. Some of it, Tommy said. Then, is Crane going to get away? No, Emma said. She said it with the confidence of someone who has looked at the geometry of a situation and believes in the math. He is not. Tommy looked at her for a moment. How do you know? Because we have his signed confession, his former employee's testimony, the territorial governor's warrant, and a lawyer who's been waiting 11 years for a case this clean. She paused. And because men like Crane make the mistake of thinking they're the only ones planning. Tommy was quiet. Then carefully, you planned all of this, didn't you? Your father and I planned it together. But the letters in his study, the mineral thing, that was you. Emma looked at him steadily. Your father had all the pieces. He just needed someone to help him see how they fit. Tommy absorbed this with the serious deliberation he brought to everything. Then he said, my mother used to do that, help him see things. He said it simply as fact without the weight of comparison, just information offered plainly by a 9-year-old who was more perceptive than most adults Emma had known. She was good at it. Emma didn't fill the silence with reassurance. She let it be what it was. She sounds like she was remarkable, Emma said. She was. Tommy looked at the book in his hands. Pa doesn't talk about her much. He's still figuring out how, Emma said carefully. Some grief takes a long time to find language. Tommy looked up. Are you going to stay? It was the same question Grace had asked that first night, in the same tone, the tone of children who have learned not to trust permanence. Yes, Emma said. Tommy, I am going to stay. Even when things are difficult, like this week, especially then. He looked at her for another moment. This boy who had been grabbed in the night and had kept his fear to himself and had called her Emma instead of ma'am for the first time that morning, and she could see him doing the final calculation, the one he'd been running since she arrived, the long assessment of whether she was the kind of person who meant what she said. He nodded once, satisfied. Okay. Good night, Emma. Good night, Tommy. She pulled his blanket up. He let her. She checked on Grace and Lily, both asleep. Lily's hand flung out across Grace's arm in the trusting abandon of a 4-year-old who has been reassured that the world is safe again, and then she went back downstairs. The marshal's deputy arrived at 11 o'clock that night, summoned by Pete's hard writing and Whitmore's efficient alarm, and he took Doyle's written statement and Nathan's copy of the ransom note and rode northeast with 2 more men from town at his back. Victor Crane was arrested at the Pryor Line Shack at 2 in the morning. His 4 remaining men, confronted with a deputy marshal's badge and the information that their employer was already facing felony kidnapping charges, made the reasonable decision not to add to their own trouble. The north pasture was unburned. The cattle were untouched. The well was whole. When the deputy came back through the Harrison gate at first light to report, Emma was already in the kitchen with the stove lit. She heard Nathan on the porch talking to the deputy in the cold morning, and she stood at the stove and let out a breath. Long, slow, the breath of someone who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time and can now finally set it down. When Nathan came inside, she poured 2 cups of coffee without turning around and set them on the table, and he sat down, and she sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the early light. "It's done." "It's done," she agreed. He wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked tired, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been braced against something large and has finally been allowed to stop bracing. But underneath the exhaustion, there was something else now. Something lighter. A quality in his face that she realized she hadn't seen before, and that she understood after a moment was relief. Simple, uncomplicated, enormous relief. "You know," he said slowly, "when I made this arrangement, I thought I was solving a problem. I needed someone to manage the house, manage the children." He looked at his cup. "I didn't think about what it meant to bring a person here. A real person with her own mind, her own way of doing things." He paused. "Her own courage." Emma was very still. "I've been—" He stopped, started again. "I have not been fair to you, not at the beginning. I looked at you in that yard, and I thought, this isn't what I arranged for. Meaning you were different from what I expected. But what I was really thinking was—" He stopped again, and she could see him fighting with the words, the way a man fights with the truth when he's not practiced at saying it. "I was thinking that you were a person, and I had treated you like a solution, and those things don't match, and it made me uncomfortable because I didn't know how to fix it." "Nathan," Emma said, "let me finish, not harshly. Just with the determination of a man who has decided to say the thing and is not going to stop until it's said. You came into this house and you learned everything. You learned the stove and the horses and the children and the north pasture and Victor Crane and the mineral rights and my lawyer's name and how to read my son's stubbornness and how to hold my daughters when they're scared." He looked up at her. "You didn't do any of that because it was in the arrangement. You did it because it's who you are." Emma held his eyes. "I want to ask you something. And I want you to know that whatever you answer, it's your answer and it stands. No arrangement. No obligation." She waited. "Do you want to stay? Not because your father sold you here, not because you signed a paper, because you choose to." The kitchen was warm and the fire was steady, and the light coming through the window was the early clean light of a Wyoming morning after a hard night, and Emma Carter looked at Nathan Harrison across a table where they had talked each other through fear and strategy and grief and plans. And she thought about the pilot light she had carried from Boston, the anger, the small sustaining flame of it. It was still there. She thought it might always be there, that particular knowledge of what had been done to her without her consent. And she thought that was all right. It was part of her, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. But it was not the largest thing anymore. "Yes, I want to stay." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just briefly, just the simple warm weight of it, and then he let go and picked up his coffee cup. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise spoken in words. It was the specific, understated gesture of a man who has decided to let someone matter to him and is doing it in the only language he's fully confident in: action. An action presence, the deliberate choice to reach across a table in the morning light. Emma picked up her coffee cup. From upstairs came the sound of small feet hitting the floor. Lily, always first awake, always immediately in motion, and then Grace's voice telling Lily to put on her socks before she came downstairs, and then Tommy's door, and Tommy's heavier footsteps, and his voice telling Grace that Lily was 4, and Grace couldn't make her do anything. Emma looked at the ceiling, listening to this ordinary, improbable, entirely real family waking up above her head. Lily's going to come down without socks. She always does, Nathan said. She's going to want the preserves on her bread. She always does. And Tommy is going to pretend he didn't do his sums last night, even though I can see his workbook was moved. Nathan looked at her. He did his sums last night. He does them every night, Emma said. He just doesn't want you to know he likes it. She paused. Don't tell him I told you. Something happened in Nathan Harrison's face. Then, that was full and clear and entirely unguarded, something that had nothing to do with practicality or arrangement, or the careful management of a man who has learned to keep things close. He looked at her, and what was there plain and undefended was gratitude, deep and specific, the gratitude of someone who has been seen. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, no socks, and looked at them both. Preserves. Nathan picked her up. Yes. Preserves. And Emma stood up and went to the pantry, and the morning came through the window, and the fire burned in the stove, and the Harrison ranch battered and tested, and firmly, finally, unambiguously intact, went about the business of a new day. Outside 3,000 acres of Wyoming lay in the clear winter light. The north pasture unburned, the well, whole, the fence line straight. The coal seam ran dark and quiet under the south ridge, patient, as everything in this country, waiting for its time. The cattle moved in the pasture, with the easy, unhurried authority of animals that belong where they are. Victor Crane would stand before a territorial judge in 60 days, and he would not be walking away from it. Owen Doyle would, by the end of that week, be learning the Harrison Ranch's particular system of fence maintenance from Jed Marsh, who trained men the way Emma trained children, with patience and the absolute expectation that they would rise to what was required. Gerald Whitmore would file the processed mineral claim the following Friday, and it would be from that moment irrevocably attached to the Harrison land title, worth more than 5 years of cattle revenue. But all of that was later. Right now, there was coffee on the table, and a 4-year-old reaching for the preserves dish, and Tommy appearing in the doorway with his hair uncombed and his arms crossed, and the precise expression of a boy who has decided that whatever his father and Emma were just talking about is deeply suspicious, and he intends to find out what it was. And Grace behind him, quiet and quick-eyed, slipping past him into the kitchen and going straight to Emma's side, the way she had started doing naturally without comment, the way water finds its level, and standing there as if it were simply where she belonged. Emma put one hand briefly on Grace's shoulder. Grace leaned in. Nathan Harrison watched this from across the kitchen, his daughter pressed against the side of the woman who had come to his door 6 weeks ago with a carpet bag and a tin of salve and more courage than he had known how to recognize at first, and he thought about the word home, what it meant, whether it was a place or a choice or a person, whether it could be all three at once. He decided it could, and in the weeks that followed, Nathan Harrison did something he had not done in a very long time. He stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was not immediate. It was not graceful. It was the slow, incremental process of a man unlearning vigilance that had kept him alive through 2 hard years, and it happened in small moments rather than grand ones. The morning he came in from the fence line and didn't check the north pasture twice. The evening he sat with Tommy on the porch after supper, without his mind running inventory on everything that could go wrong. The Sunday, he slept past 5 o'clock for the first time since Clara died and woke to the smell of coffee already made and felt before he was fully conscious, something he had almost forgotten the texture of. Safe. He felt safe. He lay in bed for a moment after he woke, just a moment examining this feeling with the caution of a man who has been burned and knows it. And then he heard Emma's voice downstairs, telling Lily that the preserves were for bread and not for fingers, and Lily's unrepentant giggle, and Grace saying something quick and clever that made Emma laugh, and he thought, this is real. This is actually happening in this house. He got up. By the 6th week, the ranch had changed in ways that weren't dramatic enough to point at, but were everywhere once you knew to look. The parlor table had become a proper schoolroom from 8 to 10 every morning, and the sounds that came from it now. Tommy arguing about long division, Grace reading aloud, with careful pride. Lily occasionally making up her own words for the ones she didn't know yet, were sounds the house hadn't held in 18 months. The kitchen ran on a system Emma had established so efficiently that even when she was occupied elsewhere, the children knew what came next and did it. Grace had started setting the table without being asked. Tommy had started checking the water trough for the horses before school, because Emma had mentioned once that it was the first thing a rancher should do in the morning, and Tommy had filed this under important and acted on it with the quiet diligence he brought to everything he decided mattered. Jed noticed. He didn't say much about it. Jed was not a man who said much, but one morning he told Emma, matter-of-factly, that the ranch was running better than it had in 3 years. And Emma said thank you, and Jed said he wasn't complimenting her. He was reporting a fact, and she said those weren't mutually exclusive, and Jed almost smiled and went back to work. Owen Doyle stayed. He was good with horses in the particular instinctive way that some men are, and he worked without complaint and without expectation of special consideration, which Nathan respected. He did not talk much about his years with Crane, and Nathan did not ask. Some accounts were settled not by conversation, but by daily conduct, and Doyle's daily conduct was impeccable. Victor Crane's trial was set for March in Cheyenne, and Gerald Whitmore wrote to Nathan regularly with updates that had the satisfied tone of a lawyer who is for once holding every card. The kidnapping charge alone was sufficient for years of imprisonment. The fraud charges layered on top of it were, as Whitmore put it, comprehensive. Several other ranchers who had been squeezed by Crane over the past 3 years came forward once the warrant was public, and the prosecutor's case grew from substantial to overwhelming. Crane had retained a lawyer from Denver, expensive and sharp, but there were things even expensive lawyers could not argue away, and a signed ransom note was one of them. The mineral claim was processed and locked in the second week of February. Nathan received this documentation on a Tuesday afternoon and brought it to the kitchen table and spread it out and stared at it for a moment, and Emma came and looked over his shoulder and read the language that said in the formal and final vocabulary of territorial law that the Harrison Ranch owned what was beneath it as completely as what stood on top of it. "My father would have done something with this," Nathan said. "You will too," Emma said, "when the time is right." He looked up at her. "You have a plan already." "I have thoughts," she said. "They're not a plan yet." "Tell me the thoughts." She sat down. She told him. She had been reading about coal operations in the territory, what they required, what they returned, how a small family operation could negotiate with a larger mining company for extraction rights without surrendering ownership of the land. She had written to a man in Laramie who had done exactly this with a smaller seam on his property. She had the numbers roughly in her head, rough enough to be honest about, and specific enough to be useful. Nathan listened. He asked questions, good ones, technical ones, the questions of a man who understood land and operations, and was now applying that understanding to a new domain. She answered what she knew and said plainly when she didn't know, and they went back and forth across the table until the lamp needed refilling, and Tommy appeared in the doorway with his hair sticking up and announced that it was 9 o'clock and he was hungry. "It's 9 o'clock and you're supposed to be asleep," Emma said. "I'm a growing boy," Tommy said. Nathan got up and cut him a piece of bread with preserves without a word, and Tommy took it with the dignity of someone who has won a minor negotiation, and Emma watched this small transaction. The father and the son, the bread and the preserves, the 9 o'clock kitchen, and felt something settle in her that had been slowly settling for weeks, something she had not named yet because naming things too early made them fragile. She was going to name it soon. The letter from her father arrived on a Thursday in late February. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope and carried it to her room before she opened it, which told her something about herself that she still needed privacy. For Charles Carter still needed walls around whatever he could make her feel. He wrote that he had heard the ranch was doing well. He wrote that he was glad. He wrote that he hoped she was here. He used the word comfortable, which Emma read 3 times with a specific expression, comfortable, and that if she needed anything, she should write. He asked if the man was treating her decently. He asked about the children. He signed it, "Your father, Charles." Emma sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about what she wanted to say back. She thought about the morning she had boarded the train, the good coat, the hand on the shoulder, the inadequate goodbye. She thought about $4,000 and a canceled debt, and she thought about what those numbers had bought and what they hadn't, and she thought he did not know what he was doing. That is not the same as forgiveness. But it is the beginning of understanding, and understanding is all I can manage right now. She wrote back. 2 paragraphs. She told him she was well. She told him the children were thriving. She told him the ranch was secure, and that the man she wrote Nathan deliberate was a good man. She told him she was not comfortable, she was necessary, and that those were not the same thing, and that she preferred the second. She signed it Emma. Not Emma Carter, just Emma. She gave it to the outgoing mail without rereading it. That same evening after supper, Nathan asked her to walk with him. Just out. Away from the house for a few minutes, away from the children's noise and the lamplight. She put on her coat, and they went out into the cold, clear night, and the stars over Wyoming were the most extravagant thing she had ever seen, and she had been here 2 months now, and they still arrested her. They walked without destination, and Nathan was quiet for long enough that she knew he was building toward something. "I want to talk about the arrangement," he said finally. Emma waited. I don't want it to be what it was." He was choosing words with the particular care of a man who doesn't use them carelessly and knows that these specific ones matter. A transaction, someone managed and managing in return. He stopped walking. "You are not an arrangement. You have not been an arrangement from the day you walked into this yard and asked me what Hollis Greer had said about you." He paused. "I want to ask you formally, to be my wife, not because of a paper my lawyer and your father signed, because I am asking you." Emma stood in the dark and the cold and the extravagant stars and looked at Nathan Harrison. She had thought when she was packing in Boston that she might someday tolerate this man. She had thought on the train that she might manage a functional working relationship with him. She had thought in the first week that he was harder to know than anything she had attempted. And she had thought at various points since things she had not finished thinking because she was busy and the ranch was demanding and named feelings were fragile. She finished thinking them now. "Yes? I'm asking you the same thing in return." He looked at her. "You're asking me to marry you. I'm asking you to choose me the same way I'm choosing you, deliberately, with full information and no arrangement and no going back." Something happened in Nathan Harrison's face, something that was complete and certain and entirely without armor, and she thought she had never seen him look so much like himself as he did in that moment. Yes, he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the dark. Wyoming night, and the cold pressed around them, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things are bigger than words, and they had both already established they knew which things those were. They were married in the first week of March, in the sitting room of the Harrison Ranch, with Jed and Pete and Owen Doyle as witnesses, and Grace so rigid with the importance of the occasion that she stood through the whole ceremony, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face solemn as a deacon's. Tommy stood beside his father with his chin up and his jaw set, and his eyes bright in the way of boys who refuse to be seen to feel things, and are feeling everything. Lily sat on the floor for most of it, because she was 4 and sitting on floors was her prerogative. And at the moment the plain-spoken circuit preacher concluded the vows, she stood up and announced that she wanted cake. "There is cake," Emma told her. Lily looked satisfied. She had known there would be. The preacher shook Nathan's hand, and then turned to Emma and said, "You've taken on a great deal, young lady." "I have," Emma agreed pleasantly. "I find I'm suited to it." The preacher looked at her for a moment, and then at Nathan, and then back at her. "Yes, I can see that." Grace, who had been waiting with the patience of a 7-year-old, at the absolute limit of her patience, took Emma's hand the moment the preacher stepped back. "Can I call you Mama now?" The room went very still. Emma looked down at this girl who had asked the very first night if she was going to stay, who had held her sister's hand on the stairs, and learned her letters in the dirt, and leaned against Emma's side in the kitchen, as if it were simply where she belonged. Emma crouched down to Grace's level. "If you want to, that's your choice, not mine." Grace thought about this with the seriousness she brought to all real questions. I want to. Emma held her eyes. Then yes. Grace put both arms around Emma's neck and held on, and Emma held back, and Tommy looked at the ceiling with immense casual disinterest, and Nathan Harrison looked at all of them, and something in his face was so full that he had to look away for a moment. Lily, meanwhile, had located the cake. The trial of Victor Crane concluded in the second week of March. Whitmore sent a telegram guilty on all counts. 10 years minimum. Congratulations. Nathan read it at breakfast and passed it to Emma, and she read it and set it on the table, and Tommy said, "What does it say?" And Nathan said, "It says Mr. Crane is going to prison for a very long time." And Tommy said, "Good." And Lily said, "Can I have more eggs?" And that was in its entirety the Harrison family's response to the conclusion of 6 months of threat and legal maneuvering and a kidnapping in the night. Emma thought this was exactly right. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, not gently, not in a straight line, but in the lurching, contradictory way of a country that did nothing gradually. One day, there was still ice on the water trough, and the next. The South Ridge was running with snowmelt, and the grass was showing through in patches, and the cattle moved differently, with the particular ease of animals that have come through winter and know it. Emma started teaching Grace to ride in April. Grace had been asking since February, and Emma had made her wait until the ground was reliably unfrozen, and Grace had waited with the compressed intensity of a child who has decided that complaining is not going to speed anything up, and patience is the only tool available. On the first morning of lessons, she appeared in the yard in her coat and her boots with her hair already braided, and her expression entirely prepared, and Emma looked at her and thought, this girl. Tommy, who had declared himself too experienced to need lessons, watched from the fence with transparent interest, and by the third day was offering corrections that were, Emma had to admit, almost always correct. "You watched your father ride," she said to him. "Every day since I could walk. You have good eyes." Tommy shrugged the way he shrugged compliments with studied indifference and visible pleasure. "It's just paying attention. That's most of it," Emma agreed. "Most of everything, actually." Tommy looked at her. He had a habit she had noticed of looking at her when she said things like that. Things that were small and practical, but applied to more than the immediate subject. He was filing them. She could see him filing them, this 9, almost 10-year-old boy who was going to be something formidable when the world gave him enough room. "Emma." "Yes." He hesitated. Tommy Harrison almost never hesitated. "Do you think if I wanted to learn accounting, the ranch accounts, would you?" "Yes," Emma said before he finished. "Starting Monday." He exhaled. "I wasn't sure if Pa would let me." "Your father was doing the accounts at 12, Emma said. "He'll let you." Tommy nodded. Then in a tone of pure information, "I'm glad Pa chose you." Emma looked at him. "He didn't at first. We both know that." Tommy met her eyes. He was 9 years old, and he had his father's directness, and his mother's precision, and his own completely original quality of absolute unsentimental honesty. "He chose you when you got off the wagon and asked about Hollis Greer. He just didn't know it yet." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Go help your sister." Tommy went, and Emma stood by the fence with the spring air around her, and the sound of Grace's voice, and the horses, and the distant work sounds of the ranch, carrying through the clear morning, and she thought about Boston, not with grief, not with anger, just with the particular clarity of someone who can look at a place from far enough away to see its actual shape. Her father had sold her. That was true. He had taken a frightened 18-year-old girl who had no mother and no real choices, and had turned her into a settlement of debts, and that was an injury she was going to carry in some form for the rest of her life. She was not going to pretend otherwise. But she was also standing on 3,000 acres of Wyoming in the spring, with a daughter learning to ride in front of her, and a son filing away everything she said for later use, and a 4-year-old somewhere in the house who was almost certainly redistributing the preserves without authorization. She was the woman who had outmaneuvered Victor Crane. She was the woman who had filed the mineral claim and written the ransom reply, and held Tommy's wrist in the dawn when Jed brought him home and said, "I've got you," without saying a word. She was the woman who had looked at a closed-off grieving man across a kitchen table and said fair enough right back at him, and meant it, and waited while he learned to mean it too. She had not been sold into smallness. She had been sent into the largest life she could have imagined, and she had filled it. A hand on her shoulder, warm and certain. Nathan coming up beside her, coffee in his other hand, eyes on Grace, making her careful circuit of the yard. "She's going to be a better rider than you in 6 months." "She already is," Emma said. "She doesn't grip with her knees." "You still grip with your knees." "I'm working on it." He stood beside her, and they watched Grace together, and the morning moved around them, and Emma leaned into him slightly. Just slightly. The small, unannounced shift of a person who has decided where they stand, and he shifted to meet it in the way he did everything, without commentary, without ceremony. The simple and complete weight of a man who has made his choice and is not going back. In May, the man from Laramie that Emma had written to came out to look at the South Ridge. He spent 2 days walking the outcroppings with Nathan and a geological consultant, and came back with numbers that made Nathan sit very still at the kitchen table for a long moment, and then look at Emma. "This is—" He stopped. "Yes. The children's futures, and their children's futures, if we negotiate correctly." She pushed the draft agreement she had prepared across the table. "Surface rights stay with the ranch. We retain 30% of extraction revenue. They fund the operation. We maintain land ownership and control." She paused. "I had Whitmore look at it." Nathan looked at the agreement. He read it with the thorough attention he brought to everything that mattered. He turned pages. He asked questions. She answered them. At the end, he set it down and looked at her. "Where did you learn to do this?" Not skeptically. With genuine open wonder. "I read everything." "I always have." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, "My father built this ranch with his hands and 30 head of cattle." "Yes." "I ran it through bad winters and a drought year and—" He stopped. "Yes," Emma said again. "And you walked in here from Boston and secured its next 100 years in 4 months." He said it simply, without drama. "You know that." Emma looked at him steadily. "We did. You had the land and the history and the title and the relationships. I had time and information and a fresh set of eyes. Neither one of us could have done it without the other." Nathan Harrison looked at his wife across the kitchen table for a long, quiet moment. "That's generous. It's accurate. Which is what I prefer to be." The agreement was signed in June. The Harrison Ranch, 3,000 acres, coal seam water rights, mineral title, locked and legal cattle operation fully functional, entered the second half of 1883 as one of the most secure properties in Laramie County. And the people who knew it knew why, and the people who didn't know the story were going to hear it eventually, because Wyoming was not a large place when it came to stories worth telling. It was Jed who told it, mostly to men in town, to other ranch hands, to the occasional traveler who stopped at the Harrison gate and was given water and a meal, and the particular Jed Marsh version of events, which was spare and factual, and somehow more dramatic for the absence of embellishment. "Man tried to take the ranch," Jed would say. "Nathan's wife figured him out before he could. The rest is just paperwork. The rest is just paperwork." Emma heard this version from Tommy, who had heard it from Pete, who had heard it from Jed, and she thought that is not the most accurate summary of events, but it is the most useful. It says this ranch is defended. It says the woman here is not decoration. It says, don't try. She would take it. In July, Nathan came into the kitchen in the evening and sat down and waited until she looked up from the account book and said, "What?" "I read it." She knew immediately what he meant. She set down her pen. "Clara's letter. My letter. I read it tonight." Emma waited. "She told me—" He stopped. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him. "She told me to find someone, not to manage alone." He stopped again. "She said the worst thing I could do to the children and to myself was to decide I was done choosing things. She said I was a man built for choosing." The kitchen was very quiet. She said she'd know whoever I found was right. If the children were loud again. Emma pressed her lips together for a moment. "They are very loud." "They are," Nathan said. They're the loudest they've been since before she got sick." He looked at Emma directly, and what was in his eyes was grief and love braided together so completely they were a single thing. "I just wanted you to know that she would have—" "I know," Emma said, gently. "I know she would have." He nodded once. He put his hand on the table, and she put hers over it, and they stayed that way for a while, not speaking, not needing to. While outside, the Wyoming summer evening settled over the ranch warm and enormous, and from upstairs came the sound of 3 children doing everything except sleeping, which was the loudest and most specific and most undeniable evidence of a house that was finally fully alive. Lily's voice floated down the stairs at full volume. "Emma!" Emma stood up. "What do you need, Lily?" she called. "I can't find my other sock." Tommy's voice exasperated. "It's under your pillow. It's always under your pillow." "It's not." "It is." Grace, patient and final. "Lily, it is under your pillow. It is always under your pillow." A pause. Then Lily's voice slightly reduced. "Oh." Emma looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Emma. Something passed between them that was complete and warm and entirely without need of translation. She went upstairs to her children. He listened to her go, her voice, the children's voices, the particular noise of a house that has decided to be full, and he sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and he thought about choosing, and what it costs, and what it builds, and what Clara had known that he had still been learning. I thought about an 18-year-old girl standing in a yard in January, with a carpet bag and a tin of salve, and more courage than anyone had told her she was supposed to have, looking at him with steady eyes, and asking who he'd been talking to about her and what they'd said. He thought I did not deserve the thing I was given, and I am going to spend the rest of my life being worth it. From upstairs the voices settled, Lily's last and longest trailing into quiet, then Grace, then Tommy, who always took the longest to stop thinking. Then nothing but the night sounds of the ranch, the cattle, the wind, the particular deep silence of Wyoming that was not empty but full of space and sky and the patient turning of seasons over a land that asked only that the people on it be equal to it. The Harrison Ranch held. The family it sheltered held harder, and Emma Carter Harrison, who had been sold like a debt and had arrived like a reckoning, stayed, not because she was arranged to, not because she had no choice, but because she had looked at this hard, cold, extraordinary life and chosen it with both hands, and it had chosen her back, and that was the only kind of love worth building anything on.